The morning Riker Holloway stood at the edge of what used to be his cornfield, the water was still rising. 40 acres. Gone. Not damaged. Gone. Swallowed under 8 feet of Missouri River mud like it had never existed at all. He was 34 years old, 3 years into a mortgage he could barely make, and he was watching everything he and Elena had built disappear beneath the current. And then he heard it. Coming from downstream, half submerged in the wreckage, a battered wooden crate drifting toward him. Inside, 86 baby chicks, barely alive. He had no idea those birds were about to change his life forever. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The land had been in the Holloway family for 2 generations, though Riker was the first to actually work it with his own hands from the start. His father had leased most of it out to neighboring operations, collecting modest rent checks and never breaking a sweat over a single row. When the old man died and left Riker the deed, everyone assumed he'd do the same thing. Find a tenant, take the money, maybe move into town and take a desk job somewhere. That's what people expected of a man who'd spent 6 years working at a grain elevator in Callaway County and had soft hands to show for it. But Riker surprised them. He and Elena had been married for 4 years by then, and they'd spent every one of those years renting a 2-room house in Mill Haven with a landlord who raised the rent every January without fail. When the 40 acres came to Riker, he didn't see rental income. He saw a way out. "We're going to farm it," he told Elena the same night the lawyer handed over the papers. She looked at him the way she sometimes did. Not skeptical exactly, but measuring. Elena Vasquez Holloway had grown up in a family that ran a small market garden operation down in Dunmore, so she knew enough about farming to understand what it actually cost. The labor, the uncertainty, the way one bad season could undo 2 good ones. "You've never planted a row of corn in your life," she said. "No," he admitted, "but I've watched enough people do it." "That's not the same thing, Riker." "I know it's not." She was quiet for a while, then she said, "What does the soil look like down by the river?" "Rich, dark, best I've ever seen." She thought about it another moment. "Okay," she said, "but we do it right. We plan it out. We don't just throw seed in the ground and hope." That was Elena. She didn't say no easily, but when she said yes, she meant it the whole way. They spent the better part of that first winter reading. Agricultural extension pamphlets, old farming manuals borrowed from the county library, dog-eared paperbacks on soil management and crop rotation that smelled like they hadn't been opened since the 1940s. Riker drove down to talk to 3 different corn farmers over in the next county, men who'd been doing it for decades, and sat at their kitchen tables asking questions until he wore out their patience. He came home each time with a notebook full of observations and a head full of things he still didn't understand. The mortgage on the property ate most of what they had. They took out an additional operating loan in the spring to cover seed and equipment rental, an old tractor on a 6-month lease, a second-hand disc harrow, a planter they bought off a retiring farmer for less than it was worth. Elena kept a ledger book on the kitchen table, tracking every expenditure with the kind of precision that made Riker's head swim when he tried to follow along. "We need this to be the good year," she told him the morning he drove the tractor out to the first field. "It'll be a good year," he said. He believed it. He had to. The spring planting went better than either of them had any right to expect. The soil along the Missouri bottomland was everything the county extension agent had called it: deep, dark, mineral-rich from decades of river deposit. The corn came up strong and even. By early June, driving along the county road, you could look across the Holloway place and see something that looked almost like a real farm. Neighbors who'd driven past that property for years without looking twice started slowing down. Old Gus Pereira, whose family ran 300 acres to the north, stopped by one July afternoon and leaned on the fence for a while without saying anything. Gus wasn't a man who gave compliments directly. He delivered them sideways or not at all. "Your stand looks decent," he finally said. Coming from Gus, that was almost a standing ovation. They weren't flush. They were still watching every dollar. But through June and July, there was a feeling in the house that was new and hard to name, something that wasn't quite confidence but was close to it. Elena started talking about the following year, what they might do differently, where they could expand if the harvest came in the way it was looking. Riker let himself imagine paying down the operating loan early, maybe building up a small cash reserve for the first time in their lives. Then August came. The rain started on a Thursday, which nobody thought much about at first. Missouri summers produced heavy thunderstorms regularly. They'd had 3 or 4 already that season, and the ground had handled them fine. But this was different. This wasn't a thunderstorm that rolled through and spent itself. This was a slow, relentless 3-day pour that showed no sign of stopping, the kind of rain that fills ditches and then creeks and then river channels until there's nowhere left for the water to go. By Saturday evening, the Missouri was running 12 feet above its normal level. Riker drove the truck down to the south fence line at dusk and stood looking at the water pushing against the bank with a feeling in his gut that had no name but wasn't good. The field was still dry, the bank was still holding, but the river sounded different than it ever had. Louder, lower, more serious, like something enormous grinding against itself. "How bad?" Elena asked when he came back in. "I don't know." She read his face. "That bad." He didn't answer. He went back out at 2 in the morning with a flashlight and found the south field already under 6 inches of water. He stood there in the dark and the rain and watched the beam of his flashlight play across the surface, the corn stalk still visible but shortened, the water moving slowly and deliberately across the ground he'd planted. He didn't wake Elena. There was nothing to do in the dark, and she needed sleep. He stood out there for another hour anyway, as if watching it could change what was happening, then came back inside and sat at the kitchen table until dawn. By morning, the field was gone, not flooded in the recoverable sense. Gone. The river had come up fast in the night, faster than anyone in the county could remember seeing, and it had brought with it the kind of force that rearranges things. When Riker walked the fence line in the gray early light, he found the soil scoured, the corn plants stripped and pressed flat, a thick layer of river debris, branches, trash, matted vegetation, covering everything like a burial. Elena came out to stand beside him. She didn't say anything for a long time. "All of it?" she finally asked. "As far as I can see." She exhaled slowly. "The north section?" "Same." He heard her swallow. "Okay," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. She had them clasped in front of her, the knuckles white. "Okay. We figure out what comes next." What came next, in the immediate sense, was a crushing silence. They walked the property for most of that first day, cataloging damage with a thoroughness that was probably unnecessary, but gave them something to do with their hands and their minds. The corn was a total loss. The equipment they'd borrowed and rented had survived. The tractor was on high ground in the equipment shed, but that was almost worse, because the equipment bill didn't care that the crop was gone. The operating loan didn't care either. The mortgage didn't care. Those things kept their schedules regardless of what the Missouri River decided to do. Riker sat down that evening with Elena's ledger and worked through the numbers 3 times, as if working through them again might produce a different result. It didn't. They were not going to make it through to next year without something changing. The numbers didn't lie and they didn't soften. 40 acres of corn, lost. All the revenue they'd been counting on, gone. The debt remained. "We could go back to the bank," Elena said. She was sitting across the table from him, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug she'd stopped drinking from an hour ago. "Ask for an extension." "On what terms? We've got nothing to offer them." "We've got the land." "The land is collateral for the mortgage. The bank already has the land." She set the mug down. There has to be something. Riker didn't answer because he didn't have one. And he'd learned early in their marriage that pretending to have answers he didn't have only made things worse between them. They went to sleep that night in a quiet that was different from the ordinary quiet of a tired evening. This was a quiet with weight to it. The following morning, Riker was walking the south fence line again, some combination of habit and inability to stay still, when he heard it. A sound coming from somewhere downstream, underneath the general noise of the still high river and the wind, a thin collective sound, reedy and desperate. He walked toward it without quite deciding to. About a quarter-mile down from the property boundary, caught against a tangle of uprooted willows that had piled up against a fence post, there was a wooden crate. It was a livestock crate, the kind used for poultry transport, wood-slatted, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, and it was listing to one side, half submerged, turning slowly in the slower water at the river's edge. Inside it, pressed together in a mass of wet yellow down, were chicks. 86 of them, as it turned out, though Riker didn't know that number yet. He waded in without thinking about it. The water was still cold, up to his knees, and hauled the crate out of the river by its rope handle. The chicks shifted and scrambled against each other with the motion, and the ones nearest the slats pressed their faces against the wood and looked at him with the unseen, round-eyed intensity of very young birds. He stood there on this bank holding a dripping crate full of baby chickens and thought, I don't have time for this. He brought them home anyway. Elena was at the kitchen table with the ledger when he came in carrying the crate. She looked up, looked at what he was carrying, and said nothing for a moment. Found them in the river, Riker said. I can see that. Figured they'd drown if I left them. She got up and came around the table to look at them. The chicks were wet and cold, and several of them were barely moving. She put her hand flat against the side of the crate to feel if they were generating any warmth among themselves. They were. Barely. We need to warm them up, she said. Elena, we can't afford... They'll die in an hour if we don't warm them up. She was already moving toward the back room, where they kept spare blankets and the old heat lamp they'd used the previous winter when a pipe froze. We'll figure out what comes after that once they're alive. That was Elena's way of making decisions. Deal with what's in front of you right now, then deal with the next thing. They set up the heat lamp in a corner of the mudroom and transferred the chicks one by one into a makeshift brooder. A cardboard box lined with torn feed sacks, the lamp positioned at one end so there was a warm side and a cooler side for the chicks to choose between. Elena's hands were sure and practiced handling them. She'd helped her mother with poultry as a girl, and some of that knowledge came back as she worked. Riker counted them while she set them up. 86 he came up with on the second count, after losing track on the first. 86 chicks, all appearing to be laying breeds, white feathers coming in at the wingtips, compact build. They're pullets, Elena said without looking up. Mostly. There might be a few cockerels in there, but mostly pullets. She tilted a chick gently in her hand. 8 weeks old, roughly. Someone was transporting them. To where? No idea. Wherever they were going, they didn't make it. By evening, the chicks were dry and moving around the brooder with the manic energy that characterized birds of that age, pecking at everything, climbing over each other, drinking water with the exaggerated throat-lifting motion of young poultry. Most of them seemed unharmed by their time in the river. Riker's neighbor from down the road, Dale Hutchins, stopped by that afternoon the way neighbors did after a flood, to commiserate and compare damage and calculate collective misery. Dale was a fifth-generation farmer with opinions about most things, and when he saw the brooder in the mudroom, he formed one quickly. You're keeping those things? He looked genuinely baffled. Riker, you can't afford chicken feed right now. Elena wants to try. Elena wants to... Dale shook his head. No offense to your wife, but you two are about to lose this farm. You need to be figuring out your finances, not raising chickens you found floating in the river. They're pullets, Elena said from the doorway. She'd been standing there long enough to hear the conversation. In 4 months, they'll be laying eggs. 4 months, Dale repeated. You'll be in foreclosure in 3. Maybe, Elena said, but they'd die if we didn't take them in, and I'm not in the habit of letting things die when I don't have to. Dale left shaking his head. He wasn't unkind. He was just a practical man who'd been doing the math on the Holloway situation and didn't like what the math was saying. The county extension office sent a damage assessor out 2 days after the flood. He was a young man named Patterson who carried a clipboard and wore clean boots that told you everything you needed to know about how much field time he actually logged. He walked the property with Riker, making notes in a careful hand, his face carefully neutral. Total crop loss, he confirmed at the end. You'll want to document everything for your insurance claim. We didn't carry crop insurance this year, Riker said. Patterson looked up from his clipboard. No coverage at all? We looked at the premiums in the spring. We couldn't afford them. The assessor wrote something on his clipboard that Riker didn't ask to see. There are federal disaster relief programs, he said carefully. The application process can take a while, and the amounts, how long? 4 to 6 months, typically, and what does the mortgage come due? Patterson stopped talking. The bank's note, Riker said. That's what matters to me, not what I might get in 6 months. The young assessor closed his clipboard with a small click. I'm sorry, he said, and he seemed to mean it. I don't have anything better to tell you. After Patterson left, Riker walked the property alone for a while. He walked the ruined bottomland first, which was still covered in a layer of silty mud that was beginning to dry and crack at the edges. Then he walked the higher ground, the hill that rose toward the north end of the property, a rocky, brush-covered slope that everyone in the family had always called the Ridge. It was useless for row crops, too steep, too thin-soiled, and Riker had never paid it much attention. It was just the part of the property nobody farmed. From the top of the ridge, you could see the whole of the bottomland laid out below, the flood damage visible in the discolored soil and the debris lines that marked how far the water had come. You could see 3 neighboring properties as well, all of them showing the same story of ruin. The Garfield place to the east, where the corn had been even taller than Riker's. The Pereira operation to the north, where Gus's winter wheat fields were buried under 6 inches of river mud. Riker stood up there for a long time, looking at all of it. When he came back down, he found Elena in the mudroom with the chicks. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, watching them with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not happy exactly, but something in that direction. Dale's right about the math, Riker said. I know he is. We've got maybe 2 months before the bank starts making calls. I know that too. He leaned against the doorframe. So what do we do? Elena reached into the brooder and let one of the chicks step up onto her finger. It looked around at the larger world with obvious alarm, then settled. She watched it for a moment. We keep moving, she said. One thing at a time. She glanced up at him. You look exhausted. I am exhausted. Go eat something. I'll be in. He went into the kitchen and ate a bowl of cold leftover beans standing at the counter, because sitting down felt like something he might not be able to get up from. Then he sat at the table with Elena's ledger and went through the numbers one more time, looking for anything he might have missed. He hadn't missed anything. The operating loan was due in November. The bank's mortgage payment was due at the end of October. They had enough cash reserves to cover exactly one of those payments, not both. They had no crop, no income stream, no realistic prospect of either before those dates arrived. He closed the ledger and sat in the kitchen, listening to the sound of the chicks from the mudroom. A steady, soft collective noise. The sound of 86 small lives doing the work of staying alive. He didn't know what he was going to do. He didn't know how they were going to hold on to this land. What he knew, the only clear thing in his head that night, was that Elena had said, keep moving, and he trusted her judgment more than his own in moments like this. She'd been right about things before when he'd been certain she was wrong. Maybe she'd be right again. He closed the ledger and went to bed. In the mudroom, under the amber warmth of the heat lamp, 86 chicks pressed together in the dark, alive, restless, already stronger than they'd been that morning. Outside, the Missouri ran quieter than it had in days, pulling back toward its banks, leaving behind everything it had decided to leave behind. The Holloways' first summer on the land was over. What came next, neither of them could see yet. But the morning would come, the way mornings always did, and there would be work to do in it, and that was going to have to be enough. The chicks were 3 weeks into their stay before Riker noticed the first one was missing. He'd counted them every morning since the flood, a habit that had started as a way to track mortality and turned into something closer to ritual. 86, he'd count, moving slowly around the brooder they'd expanded twice already as the birds grew. 86, like verifying that something he cared about hadn't slipped away in the night. That morning, he came up with 85. He counted again. 85. He checked the corners of the mudroom behind the water heater, along the baseboards where a young bird might squeeze through a gap. Nothing. He went outside and walked the perimeter of the old chicken yard, a fenced enclosure behind the equipment shed that he and Elena had hastily repaired using salvaged wire and whatever fence posts were still standing after the flood. The gate was latched. The wire looked intact. He told Elena over breakfast. One's gone, he said. She looked up from the stove. Gone how? Predator? No feathers, no blood, just gone. She set down her spatula. Show me. They walked the enclosure together, and Elena found it before Riker did. A spot along the east fence line where the wire had pulled loose from the bottom post, leaving a gap about 4 inches high. Barely enough for an adult hand to fit through, but enough for a young pullet to squeeze under. They're getting bigger faster than I thought, Elena said. That's a good sign, Riker offered. It is, but not if they're getting out. She looked at the gap, then looked toward the hill to the north, the ridge, with its scrub brush and rocky soil and tangle of wild vegetation. If it went that way, we won't find it. Too much cover. But they did find it. Or rather, Elena found it late that afternoon when she went up to the ridge to look for a fence post she thought had been stored up there during the previous owner's time. The missing pullet was at the top of the hill, pecking methodically through the undergrowth along the south-facing slope, moving with the purposeful focus of a bird that had found exactly what it was looking for. Elena stood watching it for a while before she climbed back down. She went all the way to the top, Elena told Riker that evening. How'd she get through the brush? There's a deer trail up the east side. Easy enough if you're small. Elena was quiet for a moment. The grass up there, Riker. The insects. That slope gets full sun, and there's that spring near the top. The ground stays moist. The forage up there is better than anything we've got in the yard. Riker thought about that. So we've got one escapee who found herself a better situation. Apparently. They patched the fence gap the next morning. By the following week, there were 2 more missing, then 4. Then one morning, Riker counted 61 in the enclosure and realized 25 birds had found their way out, and every single one of them had gone the same direction. They're all going to the ridge, Elena said. How are they getting through? We patched every gap. Come look. She took him to the north fence line and showed him. The birds weren't going through the fence, they were going over it. Not flying. They were still too young for much sustained flight, but they'd found a spot where an old tree root ran under the fence and raised the wire just enough that a motivated bird could scramble under it, then hop up the root, then push through. The whole operation had required cooperation. The first bird had worked at it, loosened it. Others had followed. They're working together to get out, Riker said flatly. I wouldn't put it that dramatically, Elena said. But they're persistent. Elena, they're breaking out of a chicken yard to climb a hill. They seem to prefer it up there. Riker looked at the ridge. From where he stood, the slope looked steep and uninviting, the kind of ground a farmer looked at and saw nothing but difficulty. But he thought about what Elena had said, the south-facing exposure, the spring, the dense forage. He thought about how well these birds were growing on almost nothing in the way of supplemental feed. They were foraging. They were finding their own nutrition. You want to let them go up there, he said. It wasn't a question. I want to follow them up there first, Elena said. Really look at it. They went up together on a Saturday morning in mid-September. It was the first time either of them had walked the ridge carefully, rather than just cutting across it on the way somewhere else. They went slowly, which was how Elena approached most things, and she made Riker slow down too, because his instinct was always to move fast and get the overview, rather than look at what was directly under his feet. What was under their feet turned out to matter. The soil on the south-facing slope was darker than Riker expected, richer, more organic, the kind of soil that built up over decades from leaf fall and decomposing vegetation and the gradual work of roots. It was thin in places, rocky in others, nothing like the deep bottomland they'd lost to the river. But it was alive in a way that was immediately apparent when you pushed your hand into it and felt the moisture, the warmth, the faint resistance of root systems doing their slow work. The spring Elena had mentioned was toward the top, a seep, really, more than a true spring, where water came up through a crack in the limestone shelf and trickled down through a mossy channel before spreading into the grass below. In August, at the driest part of summer, that seep had probably been barely a trickle. Now, in September, it was running clear and steady. This didn't flood, Riker said. He was standing at the high point of the ridge, looking down at the bottomland. The flood line was visible from here, a dark stain on the soil, the debris line where the water had reached and stopped. Everything below that line had been destroyed. Everything above it was untouched. The whole ridge is above the flood line, Elena said. She was crouching near the spring, looking at the soil around it. Every inch of it. It's not farmable. Not for row crops. No. She stood up. But look at this. She swept her hand at the slope around them. The grass is up here. There's more variety than I've ever seen in a managed pasture. Wild clover, the broadleaf stuff, chicory, I think. And look at the insect population. She pointed to where a cluster of pullets had followed them up the trail and were already at work, scratching methodically, heads down and purposeful. They're not scratching randomly. They're hunting. There's something up here worth eating. Riker watched the birds. They did look different up here than they did in the yard. More intent, more focused, moving with an efficiency that the confined space below didn't produce. "You're thinking about running them up here full time," he said. "I'm thinking it might be the only thing we've got," Elena said. She kept her voice even when she said it, but he heard what was underneath it. She wasn't proposing this as an exciting option. She was proposing it because it was the last option. They talked it through that night, and the next night, and the night after that. The numbers Elena put together were rough, but they were real. If the pullets came into lay in November as expected, and if the quality of their eggs reflected the quality of their diet, and if they could find buyers who would pay a premium for eggs from birds that were genuinely foraging on diverse pasture, then they had a chance. Not a comfortable chance, not a sure thing, but a chance. The feed cost is almost nothing if they're finding their own food up there, Elena said. We supplement in winter when the forage dies back, but in good weather, they feed themselves. We'd need to build some kind of shelter up there. You can't run laying hens without housing. I know, we'd need nest boxes, a windbreak at minimum. She looked at the numbers she'd written. I priced lumber last week. Elena, I know what it costs, and I know what we have. She met his eyes. If we don't do something, we lose the farm in October. This is something. They use salvaged lumber from flood debris. That was Elena's idea. The flood had left timber scattered across the lower property, fence posts and boards from structures upstream that had come apart in the current. Over 2 weekends, Riker and Elena hauled what was usable up to the ridge in a wheelbarrow, load by load, and began building. It was ugly work. The lumber was warped and mismatched, and Riker's carpentry skills were adequate at best. The structure that went up over those weekends was not a beautiful building. It was a functional one, low and solid, positioned against the west rock face of the ridge where the stone would act as a windbreak, angled to catch morning sun through the open front. Elena built the nest boxes herself, working evenings at the kitchen table with a handsaw and a box of nails, fitting them together with the precision of someone who'd grown up watching her mother solve problems with limited materials. Dale Hutchins drove past one Saturday afternoon and saw them working up on the ridge. He pulled over and hiked up the trail, which cost him some breath, and stood at the top looking at what they'd built with an expression that was trying to be diplomatic. You're putting your chicken house up here, he said. We are, Riker said. On the rocky ground. It didn't flood, Elena said without looking up from the nest box she was nailing together. Riker. Dale lowered his voice slightly, though Elena was 10 feet away and could obviously hear. I've got a cousin in Hannibal who runs a small property. He might take you two on, tenant arrangement, fair split of profits. You could get out from under this mortgage, start clean somewhere without the debt. We're not leaving, Riker said. It might be the smart... We're not leaving, Dale. Dale looked at Elena. She kept nailing. He left the way he'd come. The hens began moving up to the ridge on their own before the shelter was finished, as if they'd been waiting for the humans to catch up to a decision they'd already made. By the time October arrived, all 86 birds were spending their days on the slope, coming down in the late afternoon and filing back up to the shelter at dusk with a reliability that Riker found almost unsettling. The first eggs came in late October. 8 of them one morning, found in 3 of the nest boxes, pale brown and large for the size of the hens. Elena held one up to the light, looking at the shell quality, then cracked it into a bowl. The yolk was a color Riker had never seen in a commercially produced egg. Deep orange, almost amber, the color of something that had eaten a varied and genuine diet rather than being raised on uniform feed. Look at that, he said. Elena looked at it for a long moment. We need to find buyers, she said. That was harder than it sounded, and they both knew it. They weren't established. They had no reputation, no existing customer base. The farmers' markets in the nearest towns were already served by 2 egg operations, both long-running and well-regarded. Walking into that market with a crate of eggs from birds nobody had heard of, at prices that had to be higher than the competition to make the numbers work, was not a natural recipe for success. Elena went anyway. She loaded 2 dozen eggs into a cardboard flat and drove to the Saturday market in Caldwell and set up at a card table near the entrance and waited. She sold 6 dozen over the course of 3 hours, not from 2 dozen she'd brought, but from repeat customers who came back after tasting the first and brought their neighbors. She'd priced them 40 cents higher than the next competitor. Nobody argued. They asked questions, she told Riker that evening. Where the birds are, what they eat, how they're kept. People want to know. What did you tell them? The truth. Pasture raised on mixed forage, no purchased feed to speak of, a hillside operation in the river valley. You told them the birds live on a ridge in the middle of nowhere. I told them the birds live on naturally diverse pasture and find most of their own nutrition. She paused. It's the same thing. Riker laughed. The first real laugh in a long time. It felt strange in his throat, like a muscle that had been unused. They went back the following Saturday with 4 times as many eggs and sold out in 2 hours. The Saturday after that, they had a wait list. The money was not enough. Not yet. The amounts coming in from egg sales were real and growing, but they were growing from a small base, and the mortgage payment sitting at the end of October was a number that still exceeded what they had in the bank. Riker knew it. Elena knew it. They didn't talk about it every night because talking about it didn't change it, but it was always in the room with them. A third presence at the kitchen table, sitting in the corner, patient and inescapable. Gus Pereira came up to the ridge one afternoon in late October with no announcement, the way Gus did everything. He stood at the top and looked at the birds for a while, and then he looked at the shelter, and then he looked at the soil, and then he looked at Riker. What are you supplementing? He asked. A little cracked corn in the evenings. Mostly, they feed themselves. Off this. Gus looked at the slope with its mix of grasses and brush. Off this. Gus was quiet for a while. He was the kind of man who processed information slowly and thoroughly, which meant when he did say something, it was generally worth hearing. My laying flock cost me $400 in feed last month, he said finally, for 60 birds. Riker didn't say anything. Your feed bill for these? Gus looked at the 86 hens moving across the slope. About $30. And I'm overspending. Gus looked at the birds again. Then he looked at the soil under his boots, pushed at it with his toe. The soil's different up here than I would have thought, he said. Elena thinks it's been building up for decades. No one ever disturbed it. Gus nodded once, the way he nodded when he'd arrived at a conclusion that satisfied him. He didn't say anything else about it. He walked back down the hill without a word of farewell, which was also just Gus. But 2 days later, he stopped by the house and asked Elena if she'd sell him 24 eggs a week at the market price for his household. She said yes. It wasn't a revolution. It wasn't a rescue. It was 24 eggs a week from a neighbor who'd spent 30 years farming and chose what he bought carefully. But it was something. Then it meant someone with deep roots in that valley had looked at what they were doing and decided it was worth paying for. Riker was in the equipment shed when Elena told him, reorganizing tools they no longer had any crops to use them on. Gus asked for eggs, he said. Every week. He turned that over. Huh. He didn't compliment anything. He just asked. That's basically Gus saying you figured something out. Elena allowed herself a small, tired smile. It lasted about 3 seconds, which was long for her in those days. Then she looked at the ledger she'd brought into the shed with her. We're still short for October, she said. I know. By how much we started, we've come a long way. She set the ledger on the workbench. I'm not saying we're out of trouble. I'm saying we're different trouble than we were in August. Riker leaned against the workbench. Outside the shed door, he could see the slope of the ridge in the afternoon light, the small moving shapes of the hens working the hillside with their particular, unhurried focus. They knew something we didn't, he said. The hens? They kept going up there. We kept trying to bring them back down, and they kept going up. Elena looked at the ridge for a moment. Animals know where the food is, she said. I think it was more than food. She considered that. Maybe, she said, and she opened the ledger again because the numbers were still there and they still needed answers, and the only way to find those answers was to keep working. Outside, the hens moved across the high ground in the slanted October light, finding things in the soil that no one had taught them to look for, doing what they had always done, indifferent to what it meant to the people watching them. The mortgage payment came due on the last day of October, and Riker drove to the bank in Caldwell with a cashier's check that covered it, barely, and only because Elena had pulled $60 from a savings account she'd been building since before they were married, money she'd never mentioned keeping, which told Riker something about how carefully she'd been planning for the possibility of disaster long before disaster arrived. He didn't ask her about the account when he found out. He just took the check and drove to the bank and handed it across the counter to a woman named Mrs. Aldine Fitch, who processed payments in the loan department with the studied neutrality of someone who'd seen too many struggling families to let their situations register on her face anymore. "You're current," Mrs. Fitch said, sliding the receipt across the counter. "I know," Riker said. "Next payment is due November 30th. "I know that too." He drove home without stopping. Elena was up on the ridge when he got back, checking nest boxes, and he climbed the trail and found her there and said, "We're current." And she nodded and kept checking boxes, and that was the entire conversation. There was no celebration in it. Being current for 1 month when you were still short for the next one wasn't a victory. It was a postponement. November came in cold and gray, the way November did in the river valley, with a wind off the Missouri that made everything feel rawer than the temperature alone could account for. The hens slowed their production slightly as the days shortened. Elena had expected this, had accounted for it, but they didn't stop, and the quality of the eggs held. If anything, the yolks deepened further in color as the birds spent more time on the protected south slope, where the late-season sun still collected warmth against the rock face. The Caldwell market ran through November, and Elena was there every Saturday with a full flat of eggs and, increasingly, a short handwritten card she'd made explaining the operation. Not a fancy sign, just an index card in her careful printing, describing the ridge pasture, the forage mix, the absence of purchased feed. People read it. People asked questions. The same customers came back and brought new ones. By mid-November, they had a small but reliable customer base, and Elena had started selling to the kitchen of a roadhouse restaurant in Millhaven called Decker's, which went through 24 eggs a week and paid 15% above market rate because the cook, a heavy-set woman named Barb, who'd been there 20 years, said the yolks held their shape differently when fried, and that mattered when you were serving breakfast plates. Riker heard about a farming couple in Benton County who'd been doing something similar on a hillside property, running laying hens on natural pasture, selling direct to local customers. And he drove over one afternoon to talk to them. They were in their 60s, a couple named Weston, and they sat with him at their kitchen table for 2 hours and answered every question he had without reservation, the way farmers sometimes did when they recognized someone trying to learn rather than trying to compete. He came home with a head full of information and told Elena everything that night, talking fast, interrupting himself to circle back to things he'd forgotten to mention. Elena listened without interrupting, which was her way. When he finished, she said, "The spring on the ridge, if we could capture it properly, direct it to a gravity-fed waterer system, we'd cut the time we spend up there by half." "That's what you took from all that?" "I took a lot from all that. That's the thing I want to do first." She reached across the table and turned his notebook to a fresh page. "Draw me where the spring comes out." That was the version of things Riker held on to later, when the version of things changed. The evenings at the kitchen table, the way they worked through problems together in that grinding, methodical, unglamorous way. Not inspired, not brilliant, just persistent. Elena with her ledger and her index cards and her ability to find the practical center of any situation. Riker learning, constantly learning, how to farm land he hadn't grown up on. He held on to that version because what came next was different. The first time Riker heard the name Victor Harrow, it was from Dale Hutchins, who mentioned it the way you mention weather, as a fact of the environment that had arrived without being invited and couldn't be uninvited. "You hear about the Garfield place?" Dale said. He'd stopped by to return a come-along he'd borrowed in the fall. "What about it?" "Sold. Quick sale, apparently. Family took an offer and signed inside a week." Riker looked up from the tractor he'd been working on. The Garfields, Robert and his wife Susan, had lost their corn the same way the Holloways had. Robert had talked to Riker twice since the flood, both times with the hollow, careful manner of a man doing arithmetic in his head constantly and not liking the results. "Who bought it?" "Development group out of St. Louis. Guy named Victor Harrow runs it." Dale said it carefully, like the name had some texture to it he was testing. "He's been buying farm debt from the county banks, not the farms themselves, the notes. Then he approaches the families directly." Riker set down his wrench. "He's buying the debt, and then he can offer them 2 choices. Sell to him at his price, or watch him call the note and take it in foreclosure." Dale shrugged, though it wasn't the kind of shrug that indicated indifference. Garfields took the offer. Can't say I blame them. They were 6 months behind. Riker thought about the Garfields, Robert and Susan, their 3 kids, the farm that had been in Susan's family since her grandfather broke the ground. He thought about Susan Garfield's face at the Caldwell market in September, the way she'd looked at Elena's eggs without buying any because she was counting every dollar. How many notes has he bought? Riker asked. Don't know exactly. 4, 5 in this county, maybe more. Dale picked up his come-along. Yours included, from what I hear. Riker went very still. Say that again. Third Valley Bank sold your note to Harrow's company about 3 weeks ago. Didn't anyone notify you? No? Banks don't have to, typically. The debt transfers, the terms stay the same, the lender changes. Dale looked uncomfortable, the way he always looked when he was delivering information he hadn't wanted to deliver. You're still current. That's good. But he owns your note now. Riker went inside and told Elena before he'd even taken off his boots. She sat very still for a moment. Then she opened the ledger. We're current, she said. For now. As long as we're current, he can't do anything. She said it firmly, the way she said things when she needed them to be true. The terms don't change because the lender changed. Elena? I know. She closed the ledger. I know. Victor Harrow came to the valley in person in the second week of November. He drove a dark green truck, new and clean, in a way that farm trucks in the valley were not, and he visited 6 properties in 2 days. Riker heard this from Gus Pereira, who had heard it from the Machin family to the south, whose note Harrow had also acquired. Harrow was, by all accounts, polite. He didn't threaten. He brought paperwork that laid out what he was offering, a purchase price for the land, a clean transaction, the family's debt erased, and a check in their hand within 30 days. He presented it as a kindness, an exit from a situation that was only going to get harder. He didn't raise his voice or make demands. He just explained what his company intended to do with the River Valley land. A large-scale agricultural operation, he called it, though the details of exactly what kind of agricultural operation were never quite specified, and what the family's alternatives were if they chose not to sell. He came to the Holloway place on a Thursday afternoon. Riker was on the ridge when the green truck pulled into the drive, and Elena was in the kitchen. She came to the door and watched him get out. A tall man, somewhere in his 50s, wearing a canvas jacket and boots that were clean enough to suggest he didn't spend much time in fields. He smiled when he saw her. It was a good smile. Practiced, but good. Mrs. Holloway, I'm Victor Harrow. I believe we have a mutual business arrangement. I hold your property note through Third Valley. I was hoping to have a few minutes of your time. You can have a few minutes, Elena said. She didn't invite him in. He stood on the porch and made his presentation. He had a folder of documents, and he referred to them without handing them to her, which she noticed. He talked about the difficulty of the season, the challenges facing small operations in the River Valley, the reality of commodity markets, and operating costs. He framed everything with a kind of sorrowful practicality, as if he was delivering difficult news he wished he didn't have to deliver. His offer for the property was, Elena calculated quickly, about 70% of what the land was worth before the flood. Roughly 60% of what it was worth with the ridge included. That's a fair offer given current conditions, he said. It isn't, actually, Elena said. It's a below-market offer presented to people who are under financial pressure. That's different from fair. Harrow's smile didn't change. I understand how it might feel that way. I'm not describing a feeling, I'm describing a valuation. She kept her voice even. We're current on the note. We intend to stay current. Is there something else you needed? He looked at her for a moment with an expression that recalibrated slightly, something shifting behind the practiced pleasantness. The note comes with a first frost acceleration clause, he said. Did you review the full terms when you signed? Elena looked at him. If the property shows insufficient operating revenue by the date of first frost, as evaluated by the note holder, the remaining balance can be accelerated, called in full. He said it gently, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he's not sorry about. It's standard language in agricultural operating loans from Third Valley. I'd encourage you to review your paperwork. He left without pushing further. Riker came down from the ridge 20 minutes later and found Elena at the kitchen table with the loan document spread across it, reading. She didn't look up when he came in. He's right, she said. There's an acceleration clause. First frost is projected for November 22nd. Riker sat down. How much? The full remaining balance, $31,000. The number sat between them. In 9 days, Riker said. In 9 days. He tried to think of something useful to say. He couldn't. What counts as sufficient operating revenue? That's the problem. The clause says, as evaluated by the note holder, it's discretionary. He decides if we qualify. Riker stopped. That's the whole point of it. He buys the notes and uses the clause to force the sale. Yes. He doesn't want fair. He wants the land. Yes, Riker. Elena's voice was flat with a tiredness that wasn't physical. That's what this is. They sat with it for a while. Outside, the wind moved through the brush on the ridge. The hens were still up there, working the slope in the cold, indifferent to the conversation happening below them. Riker drove to see 2 neighboring families that week, the Machins and the Dolores, to find out what they'd been offered and whether anyone had a lawyer looking at the acceleration clauses. The Machins had already signed. Danny Machin shook his hand in the driveway with the hollow look of a man who'd made a decision he knew he'd be processing for years. It's done, Danny said. We couldn't see another way. The Dolores hadn't signed yet, but Paul Dolores' wife, a small, nervous woman named Ruth, told Riker they were meeting with Harrow again on Friday. Don't sign anything Friday, Riker said. Paul looked at him. Easy for you to say. You've got that ridge operation going. We've got nothing. The flood took everything we had. Riker heard the edge in it and didn't argue. Paul wasn't wrong that their situations were different. The Holloways had the ridge, the Dolores had flat bottomland and no alternative ground. He drove home and told Elena about both visits. Paul thinks we're in a different situation, he said, and he's not entirely wrong. No, Elena agreed. But the ridge method works on their land too. There's high ground on the Dolore property. That stand of timber in the northeast corner. The soil under those trees. Elena, we've got 9 days. I know how many days we have. She looked at him with something in her eyes that wasn't quite frustration, but was adjacent to it. I'm trying to think about what comes after 9 days, regardless of what happens to us. Because if Harrow gets this valley, the Dolores and the Greshams and everyone else loses their land too. And I'm not willing to only think about ourselves. Riker didn't answer. He knew she was right. He also knew that if they lost the farm, the question of what happened to their neighbors was going to be someone else's problem. He didn't say that out loud. They made a decision that week that Elena had been pushing for since October, to be more open about what they were doing on the ridge. She'd written up a simple description of the method, 2 pages in her careful hand, explaining the high ground principle, the forage management, the water capture system they'd built, the economic difference between purchased feed operations and pasture operations. She'd shared it with Gus Pereira because Gus had asked specific questions, but she'd been hesitant to share it more widely. Her hesitance had been about timing. She wasn't sure the method was proven enough to promote, wasn't sure they understood it well enough themselves to be teaching it. But the clock Harrow had put on them changed the calculation. If there was something worth sharing, the time to share it was now. They drove to 3 properties on a Sunday afternoon. The Dolores, the Greshams, and the Prestons, who had ridge ground similar to the Holloways, and sat at kitchen tables and walked fence lines and showed the method as best they could in a single afternoon. Riker talked. Elena drew diagrams on whatever paper was available. They answered questions for as long as anyone wanted to ask them. The response was not what either of them had hoped for. Ruth Dolore listened carefully and then said, "This sounds like something you could do because you'd already lost everything. We still have a chance of getting out with something in our pockets." Tom Gresham, who was in his 60s and had been farming the same property for 40 years, looked at the diagrams Elena had drawn and said, "You want us to run chickens on a hillside. You want us to give up row crops for chickens on a hillside." "The row crops are gone," Elena said. "The flood took them. The row crops will come back next year if we've still got the land to plant them on." "And if there's another flood?" Tom looked at her steadily. "There might not be." They drove home in the dark. Elena sat with her diagrams folded in her lap. "They think we're desperate," Riker said. "We are desperate. They think we're trying to sell them on something because we need allies." Elena looked out the passenger window at the dark fields passing. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe we are. That was the part that corroded things. The rumor started somewhere, Riker never found out exactly where, that the Holloways were promoting the Ridge method not because it worked, but because they needed other families to buy into it to establish a market, to create enough demand for their eggs and breeding stock that their own operation became viable. That they were, in other words, using desperate neighbors to rescue themselves. It spread the way rural rumors spread. Through the grain elevator, the hardware store, the parking lot of the Caldwell Market on Saturday mornings. Nobody said it to their faces. Nobody needed to. By the third Saturday of November, 3 of Elena's regular customers didn't show up. The wait list that had been building through October quietly disappeared. Barb at Decker's restaurant called on a Monday to say she was going to put their egg order on hold for a few weeks. Nothing personal, Barb said. Just, people are talking, and I can't afford to be in the middle of something. Elena thanked her and hung up and stood in the kitchen for a long moment looking at the phone. Riker found her there. What? Decker's canceled. He put his hand flat on the counter. Who's spreading this? Does it matter? It matters to me. It matters to you, Elena said. But knowing who it is doesn't change what it's cost us. She turned from the phone. We're 4 days from the first frost deadline, and our revenue just dropped by a third. Riker pushed away from the counter and walked to the back door and stood looking at the ridge in the flat November light. The hens were up there, moving in their methodical way across the slope, working the ground the way they always worked it, unconcerned with what was being said about them in town. He'd never felt so far from an answer as he did in that moment. The farm they'd fought for, the method they'd built from nothing. The reputation Elena had spent months building at a card table in the Caldwell Market. All of it unraveling in the space of 2 weeks because a man with a clean truck and a folder of documents had arrived with a plan, and the plan was working. He turned back inside. He doesn't need us to fail, Riker said. He just needs us to look like we're failing. Then the bank accepts his evaluation of insufficient revenue and calls the note. Elena nodded slowly. So the question is whether we can look like we're not failing by the 22nd. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Show me the numbers. All of them. Everything we've got. Elena sat down across from him and opened the ledger. The numbers were what they were. Not enough and not quite nothing, which was the worst possible place to be, the place where you could see the edge clearly and had just enough ground under your feet to feel what losing it would mean. Outside, the sky was going gray in the west, the kind of gray that carried cold in it, the leading edge of whatever system was building out over the plains and moving toward the valley. 4 days to first frost. Riker looked at the numbers and then looked at his wife across the table, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there wasn't anything to say that the numbers hadn't already said more clearly. The rain started on the 19th of November, 3 days before the first frost deadline, and it came in hard. Not the slow gray drizzle that November usually brought to the river valley. This was a driving rain, cold and heavy, the kind that found every gap in a coat and every crack in a barn wall. By the first evening, the ditches along the county road were running full. By the second morning, Riker stood at the south fence line and watched the Missouri doing what the Missouri did when it had too much water in it and not enough patience to hold it, rising, pushing, testing the banks with a quiet, systematic pressure that didn't announce itself until it was already too late to do anything about what it had decided. He went back inside and told Elena. She was at the kitchen table with the ledger, the same place she'd been for 3 days, working the numbers from every angle she could find. She'd called 2 buyers she hadn't approached before. She'd driven to a specialty grocery in Millhaven that she'd heard was looking for local suppliers. She'd written a letter to the county agricultural office about the acceleration clause that she didn't entirely believe would accomplish anything, but felt like something she had to try. None of it had moved the numbers enough. How bad? She asked, without looking up. Bad enough. The bank's going to hold. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the window. If it keeps up another day, we're looking at another flood. Elena closed the ledger. Not the way she closed it when she was done working. The way she closed it when she'd arrived at a conclusion and needed to stop looking at the pages to think clearly about what it meant. The Delores, she said. What about them? Their bottomland is lower than ours was. If we flood, they flood worse. She looked at Riker. They didn't sign with Harrow yet. Paul told you they had until the end of the month. Elena, their livestock is in the low barn. I know where their livestock is. Their feed stores, too. Everything they've got left is in that low barn, Riker, and if the river comes up the way it came up in August, we have our own problems. He said it, and then he heard how it sounded, and he didn't take it back because it was true, but he didn't say anything to reinforce it either. Elena stood up from the table. She went to the back window and looked at the sky. Still dark, still moving, the clouds low and fast and purposeful. Then she looked at the ridge. "We have the high ground," she said. He knew what she meant before she finished saying it. He'd known it was coming, probably, from the moment he walked in the door. That was the thing about Elena. She moved toward difficult decisions the way the river moved toward low ground. Not dramatically, just inevitably. "If we go to the neighbors," Riker said slowly, "and we offer the ridge, our operation, to store their animals and their feed and their tools while the water rises. Yes, we've got $31,000 coming due in 3 days. We've got a man who wants our land actively looking for reasons to call our note. And you want to spend the next 24 hours helping every struggling family in a 5-mile radius move their livestock onto our property. Yes. Instead of spending those hours trying to find revenue that might keep him from pulling the trigger on that acceleration clause. Yes?" She turned from the window. "Because if we don't, those families lose everything. And because—" She stopped, swallowed. "Because if we're going to lose this farm anyway, I want to lose it doing something that was worth doing. I don't want to spend the last 3 days of it making phone calls that aren't going to work." Riker looked at her for a long moment. The thing was, he knew she was right about the phone calls. He'd known it for 2 days. The numbers had a finality to them that 3 more days of effort wasn't going to change. Harrow had timed this carefully. The acceleration clause, the rumor, the revenue hit from Barb at Decker's. He'd constructed a situation where the Holloway's options were narrow regardless of how hard they worked them. "If we do this," Riker said, "and they see the ridge working, see it actually saving their animals, their seed, their gear, that's proof. That's not us telling them it works, that's them seeing it." "That's not why I want to do it," Elena said. "I know it's not. I'm just saying it's also true." She thought about that. "Okay," she said. "It's also true." Riker set his coffee down. "Who do we call first?" They started with Gus Pereira, because Gus was practical, and because his operation was large enough that if he saw the logic in it, he'd move fast. Riker drove over in the rain and found Gus in his equipment shed, watching the water in the north ditch with the same expression Riker had been wearing an hour earlier. "Your low ground's gonna go," Riker said. "I know it. We've got the ridge. Come move your breeding stock up there. Bring your winter feed if you can get it on a wagon. Bring your tools." Gus looked at him with the slow, evaluating look that was his default response to almost everything. "You're not charging for this." "No." "Why not?" Riker thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you bought eggs from us when you didn't have to," he said. "And because Elena thinks it's right, and because—" He stopped. "Because we might lose the farm in 3 days, and I'd rather spend those 3 days doing something that matters." Gus was quiet for a long moment, looking at the ditch. "I'll get my boys," he said. They spent that afternoon moving. Gus had 2 grown sons who worked the operation with him, and all 4 men, Gus, his sons, and Riker, ran a relay of wagons between the Pereira low barn and the ridge while Elena directed the incoming animals and equipment, assigning space with the calm efficiency of someone running a field hospital. The Pereira breeding flock, 40 birds Gus had been building for a decade, went into the far end of the Holloway shelter, separated from the laying hens by a partition Riker nailed up in 20 minutes, using boards he pulled from the scrap pile. Gus's winter grain stores, 500 pounds of seed corn he'd salvaged and dried and had been protecting like it was currency, went into the Holloway equipment shed on pallets, elevated off the floor. By evening, the word had spread the way word spread in the valley, which was fast and without anyone intending it to. Dale Hutchins called. The Gresham family sent their oldest son over to ask if the offer was real. Ruth Delory drove up the Holloway Drive in a truck that was already loaded with feed sacks and asked Elena, without preamble, if there was room. "There's room," Elena said. "Paul thinks we should sign with Harrow." "That's Paul's decision." Ruth looked at the rain, then looked at the ridge. "The low barn is going to go. I can see it from our kitchen window, how the water's moving. She looked at Elena. Is this real? The ridge farming? Is it real, or is it something you two put together because you needed it to be real? Elena held her gaze. Come up and look at the hens tomorrow morning, she said. If it's still standing then, come look. Bring Paul. I'm asking you now. I know you are. And I'm telling you, yes, it's real. The hens found it before we did. All we did was follow them. Ruth sat in her truck for a moment, then she got out and started pulling feed sacks from the truck bed. Tell me where you want these. By nightfall, the ridge was something neither Riker nor Elena had planned or anticipated. It had become a kind of temporary commons, a high ground holding the accumulated necessities of 4 neighboring families, their seed and their tools and their breeding animals. All of it brought up the deer trail and the east path in wagons and on backs, and in whatever containers were available. Tom Gresham's wife brought a crate of canning jars she'd been worried about in the low cellar. Dale Hutchins brought a hand-forged set of tools that had belonged to his grandfather. Small things. The things people moved when they were moving what they couldn't afford to lose. Riker worked through the night. He wasn't alone. Gus's eldest son stayed to help, and Dale was there until 2 in the morning, and Paul Delory showed up at midnight without a word and started moving things without being asked. Paul didn't look at Riker or speak to him directly. He just worked. That was its own kind of statement, and Riker didn't push for more. The river crested at dawn on the 20th. Not as high as August, not quite, but high enough. The Holloway bottomland went under again, 4 feet this time instead of 8, the second flood in the same season arriving with less drama than the first, but with the same indifferent efficiency. The Delory Low barn went to 3 feet of water by mid-morning. The Gresham equipment shed, which had survived August, went under at the door threshold and stopped there, which was better than it could have been and worse than Tom had hoped. Riker stood at the fence line in the gray early light and watched the water come up over ground he'd planted and lost and planted again in his mind 100 times since August. There was something that happened to you the second time you watched a flood take the same ground. The first time was shock and grief and disbelief. The second time was something quieter and colder, a kind of grim recognition. This is what this land does. This is the truth of this place. He went back up to the ridge. The animals were there. All of them. The Pereira breeding flock. The Delory's 2 dairy cows that had been walked up the trail at midnight by Paul's teenage daughter, the Gresham's seed stores. The Holloway laying hens moved through it all with their characteristic indifference to everything that wasn't edible, stepping around the newcomers without ceremony. The ridge held. That was the plain fact of it. While the bottomland went under, the ridge stood dry and clear above the waterline, exactly as it had in August, exactly as it had been standing dry and clear above every flood that had come through this valley in the decades before any of them had been there to notice. Gus Pereira came up mid-morning and stood looking at his breeding flock, all 40 birds alive and calm and already starting to forage along the south slope the way the Holloway hens had been doing for 2 months. He stood there a long time. They're eating, he said. They started this morning, Elena said. The forage is still good up here, different from the bottomland. The frost hasn't killed the root systems. Gus looked at the soil under the birds' feet. He crouched down and pushed 2 fingers into the ground the way Riker had seen Elena do months ago when they first walked the ridge together. He felt the warmth and the moisture and the density of it. He stood back up. I've farmed this valley for 32 years, he said, and I've never put an animal on this ground. Neither had anyone else, Elena said, because it's not farmable. It's not farmable for corn, Riker said. It's something else. Gus looked at the hens. He looked at the spring seep, which was running clear and clean despite the rain, feeding the gravity water they'd built in September. He looked at the shelter that Riker and Elena had built from salvaged flood lumber, ugly and functional and still standing. How many eggs are you running a week? He asked. 60 plus. We'd be more if we hadn't lost market share last week. Why'd you lose market share? Riker looked at him. You know why, Gus. Gus made a sound that wasn't quite acknowledgement and wasn't quite dismissal. I heard the talk, he said. I didn't put much weight to it. He was quiet for a moment. Should have said that out loud at the time. It was as close to an apology as Gus Pereira was built to deliver. Riker understood that and accepted it. Paul Delory came up in the early afternoon. after the water had crested and begun its slow retreat from the bottomland. He stood at the top of the trail and looked at the scene across the ridge. His family's feed stores stacked dry under the equipment shed overhang. His daughter's dairy cows standing placidly in the makeshift pen Elena had built from borrowed fence panels. The whole chaotic and functional arrangement of a dozen families' most essential things gathered on high ground because two people had followed a flock of chickens up a hill. He stood there long enough that Riker went over. "It works," Paul said. He said it without enthusiasm, not because he wasn't moved by it, but because Paul Delory was a man who processed things internally and delivered them delayed and compressed. "The ridge works," Riker agreed. "I thought you were selling us something." Paul kept his eyes on the cows. "I thought you needed us to buy in so you could stay afloat." "We did need that. That part wasn't wrong." Paul looked at him. "We needed revenue. We needed market. We needed people to see what we were doing and believe it was real." Riker said it flatly, without defense. All of that was true. It's also true that the method works. Both things can be true at the same time. Paul was quiet. "Ruth believes you. She believed you before I did." Ruth was right. "Yeah." Paul exhaled. "She usually is." They stood side by side in the rain for a moment, looking at the bottomland below, covered in gray water, the fence posts just visible, the field that had been promising corn in June and flood debris in August and nothing in November. "We're not signing with Harrow," Paul said. Riker turned to look at him. "He came by again yesterday, raised his offer slightly. Same terms, slightly more money." Paul's jaw was tight. "He told me that you two were going under, that the bank was going to call your note this week, and once your operation collapsed, the Ridge method collapsed with it, and I'd be left holding a worthless idea and a property I couldn't farm." He paused. He said it like he knew it for a fact. "He might," Riker said. "Maybe, but he's standing in St. Louis, and I'm standing here, and I can see your cows are dry, and mine are dry, and Tom Gresham's seed corn is dry." Paul looked at the ridge around them. "Whatever happens to you two with the bank, and I'm not saying it works out because I don't know, this ground did what you said it would do." Riker nodded. "That means something to me," Paul said. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't." Elena had been listening from 10 feet away, not intruding. Now she came over. "Your northeast timber stand," she said to Paul. "The high ground in the corner of your property. Have you ever put animals up there?" "It's too rough for cattle, not for poultry." She looked at him steadily. "In the spring, if you wanted to start a small flock, we could help." "Not for free," she added quickly. "We'd sell you breeding stock at cost and help you set up the infrastructure. You'd be running your own operation within a season." Paul looked at her, then at Riker, then back at Elena. "Why are you offering that?" "Because if 3 or 4 operations in this valley are running this system, nobody can call it a fluke. Not Harrow, not the bank, not anybody." She said it plainly. "And because your land deserves a farming method that works on it." Paul said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Let's talk about it in the spring, if there's a spring to talk about it in." That evening, the families who'd moved things to the ridge began moving some of them back, the water retreating, the low ground emerging muddy and wrecked but present. Not everything went back. The Pereira breeding flock stayed on the ridge, Gus said, until he figured out what to do with the low barn, which had taken water damage at the foundation. The Delory seed stores stayed up, Paul said, because he didn't trust the bottomland not to flood again before March. Riker sat on the rock wall at the top of the ridge as the light went gray, and the valley below him slowly reappeared from under the water. He was exhausted in a way that went down to the bone. 2 days of near-continuous work, no real sleep, the constant low-grade fear of what was coming in 3 days sitting underneath everything else like a stone he couldn't put down. Elena came and sat beside him. She had mud on her jacket and a scratch on her left hand from a fence panel she'd moved in the dark the previous night. She looked as tired as he felt. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow's the 21st. "I know what day it is." She leaned against him, not dramatically, just the weight of being tired and close to someone. "What's our number right now?" He told her, the operating revenue figure they had documented and could show to a note holder. It was better than it had been 4 days ago. Gus had paid them 2 weeks in advance for the ridge space, unsolicited, folding the bills and handing them to Elena that morning without commentary. Dale had done the same. Small amounts. Not enough. He's going to call the note, Riker said. Maybe. Elena. I said maybe. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not giving up tomorrow. I'll spend tomorrow doing every last thing I can think of to show sufficient operating revenue. But tonight? She looked at the valley, the receding water, the distant lights of neighboring farmhouses beginning to appear as the clouds thinned. Tonight, I want to just sit here. Riker put his arm around her. She was cold and she didn't move away. Below them, the valley looked like something after a battle, marked, altered, the landscape rearranged by forces that didn't ask permission. The fence lines ran crooked through the mud. The field boundaries were blurred by silt and drift. From up here, it was hard to tell where one property ended and the next began. The hens had already roosted in the shelter behind them. 86 birds plus 40 of Gus Pereira's settled in the darkness together with the total indifference to human trouble that was, Riker had come to believe, not a deficiency in the birds, but a kind of honesty about what mattered and what didn't. The ridge was still there. The spring was still running. The soil under their boots was still the dark, live, mineral-rich ground that the birds had found months ago when no one was looking for it. Whatever happened in the morning, that was still true. Riker held on to that, and his wife, and the dark, and let the exhaustion take him toward something close to sleep. Riker was up before dawn on the 21st. He didn't sleep so much as drift in and out of something that felt like sleep. A shallow, restless half-consciousness, where the numbers kept reassembling themselves behind his eyes in different combinations that always arrived at the same result. He gave up at 5 a.m, dressed in the dark without waking Elena, and went downstairs and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him. He knew what the ledger said. He'd known for 3 days. But there was something in him that couldn't stop looking at it, the way you couldn't stop pressing on a bruise even knowing exactly how much it was going to hurt. The operating revenue figure they could document was still short. Not drastically, not embarrassingly, but short of anything a reasonable note holder would call sufficient. Gus's advance payment had helped. Dale's had helped. But Harrow's acceleration clause didn't specify a threshold, and that was the whole design of it. The threshold was whatever Harrow decided it was on the day he decided to decide. Elena came downstairs at 6. She looked at him, looked at the ledger, poured herself coffee, and sat across from him. I've been thinking, she said. All night? Most of it. She wrapped both hands around the mug. There's one thing we haven't tried. I've been through everything. Not everything. She looked at him steadily. We haven't gone to the County Agricultural Board directly. Not with a letter. In person. Today. We bring the ledger, we bring the egg records. We bring the documentation on the ridge operation, and we sit in front of whoever will see us, and we explain what Harrow is doing. Riker thought about it. The board doesn't regulate private note holders. No, but they regulate land use in this county, and if Harrow's plan is a large-scale agricultural operation, whatever that means, he's going to need permits and approvals that go through that board. She set her mug down. If we can establish that what he's actually doing is forcing distressed sales to consolidate land, that's a different conversation than the one he's been having with everyone. We don't have proof of what his plan is. We have 5 families in this valley who've been approached with the same offer using the same acceleration clause from the same note holder. That's a pattern. She opened the ledger to a page near the back where she'd been keeping notes, dates, names, offer amounts, the language of the approaches each family had described to Riker when he'd visited them. He hadn't known she'd been writing it down. She'd been writing it down for weeks. He looked at the page. Then he looked at her. When did I start thinking we might need to document this? About 3 days after Harrow showed up on our porch. She closed the ledger. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to assume the worst before I had to. And now? Now I have to. They were in the truck by 7:30, the ledger and a folder of documents on the seat between them, driving through the post-flood morning with its particular quality of light, thin and washed, the fields on both sides of the road still carrying the wet darkness of saturated soil, the fence posts trailing lines of debris at their bases like watermarks. The county agricultural office was in Caldwell, in a building that also housed the extension office and the soil conservation service, a low brick structure that smelled like old paper and floor wax. The woman at the front desk told them the board didn't meet until Thursday. I need to speak with whoever's available today, Elena said. It's time sensitive. Most of the staff are out doing flood damage assessments. Then whoever isn't. Elena's voice was polite and absolutely firm. We can wait. They waited for 40 minutes. Then a man named Gerald Foss, who turned out to be the Assistant Director of Agricultural Development for the county, came out and looked at them with the cautious expression of a bureaucrat who'd learned to identify people who were going to require actual attention rather than a standard form. Mr. and Mrs. Holloway, he said. Thank you for seeing us, Elena said, and she walked past him toward his office before he finished the sentence. Gerald Foss was somewhere in his late 50s, a former county extension agent who'd moved into administration and still carried the practical instincts of someone who'd spent time in actual fields. He listened without interrupting as Elena laid it out. The flood, the note purchase, the acceleration clause, the pattern of approaches across multiple valley families, the documentation she'd compiled. Riker added detail where she flagged him, mostly around the conversations he'd had with the Machins and the Delores and the Greshams. When Elena finished, Foss looked at the notes she'd put in front of him. He was quiet for a moment. I know the Third Valley Acceleration Clause, he said. It's been in their agricultural operating loans for about 15 years. Most note holders never invoke it. It's too aggressive. It tends to generate complaints. He looked up. The fact that Harrow bought these notes specifically and is invoking it specifically suggests he understood what he was purchasing. Yes, Elena said. That's what it suggests. I can't stop a private note holder from calling a note that's technically within the terms of the contract, Foss said. That's not within my authority. I know that, Elena said. But if his company is planning a large-scale agricultural development in this valley, what permits does he need from this office? Foss looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled his keyboard toward him and typed something. He read the screen, typed again, read again. Harrow Agricultural Holdings filed a preliminary development inquiry with this office 6 weeks ago, he said, for a consolidated grain operation and processing facility on approximately 800 acres of Missouri River bottomland in this county. He looked up. We haven't seen a formal application yet. The preliminary inquiry is not public record. 800 acres, Riker said, roughly. There's maybe 1,200 acres of farmable bottomland in this section of the valley. He's trying to buy 2/3 of it. Foss closed whatever he was looking at on the screen. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. A project of the scale described in that preliminary inquiry would require an environmental impact review, a water rights assessment, floodplain development permits, and approval from the county commission. He put his glasses back on. It would also require that the land in question actually be available for development, which it is not if the current property owners retain their deeds. But it will be available, Elena said quietly, if he invokes enough acceleration clauses in the next 2 weeks. Foss looked at her. He looked at the folder on his desk. He looked at Riker. Leave me a copy of your documentation, he said. They left everything Elena had compiled. The dates, the names, the offer amounts, the notes from each family's description of their approach. They left a summary of the ridge operation with the revenue documentation. They left a copy of the acceleration clause language from their own loan agreement. As they were leaving, Foss said, Mrs. Holloway. Elena turned. Your ridge operation. The pasture-raised poultry method. The documentation you've included here. He tapped the folder. Is this replicable on similar high-ground properties? We believe so, Elena said. We've been trying to share it with our neighbors for 2 months. He nodded slowly. Leave me your phone number. They drove home not knowing what that meant, not knowing if it meant anything. Elena sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the road and didn't try to interpret it, which was harder than it looked. We did what we could do, she said finally. Yeah. Whatever happens tomorrow, I know. She didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need her to. The 22nd arrived the way deadlines arrived. Not dramatically, just as a date that had been coming for a while and was now simply here, a Tuesday morning with frost on the truck windshield and a cold white sky. First frost. The clause's trigger, if Harrow chose to pull it. Riker was up early again, and this time he didn't sit with the ledger. He went up to the ridge instead, in the cold and the silence, and walked the south slope while the hens were still in the shelter, before they'd come out for the day. He walked it slowly, the way Elena had made him walk it the first time, looking at what was actually there rather than what he was worried about. The soil under the frost-stiffened grass, the spring seep still running, a thin silver thread in the cold air. The limestone shelf, the windbreak of the west rock face, the long view down to the bottomland, and the glittering line of the Missouri in the distance. 86 hens. That's what had started this. A battered crate floating downstream, and the decision to wade in and pull it out. And Elena saying they'll die if we don't warm them up. And then the birds doing what birds do. Finding the best ground available and going to it, over and over, until the humans finally paid attention. He stood at the top of the ridge for a long time. Then he heard the truck on the county road below, and he watched it turn into the Holloway Drive, and he knew from the color of it, dark green, clean, that it was Harrow. Riker came down the trail. Harrow was standing in the drive when Riker reached the bottom, his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket, looking at the property with the assessing gaze of someone calculating what things were worth. Elena had come to the door, but not out of it. "Mr. Holloway," Harrow said, "I wanted to deliver this personally." He held out an envelope. Riker took it. He didn't open it. "That's a notice of intent to accelerate under the terms of your operating note," Harrow said. "The review period expires in 7 days. At that point, the full balance of $31,000 will be due." "You've reviewed our operating revenue documentation," Riker said. "I have. And you've determined it's insufficient. Given the standards for a viable agricultural operation at this acreage, yes." Harrow said it without apology or pleasure. Just fact, delivered cleanly. "I want to be clear. I'm not doing this to harm your family. I'm doing this because the business situation is what it is. My offer to purchase the property remains open. The terms are fair. They're not fair," Riker said. The same words Elena had said on the porch 6 days ago. "You know they're not fair." Harrow looked at him with the patient expression of a man who'd had this conversation before and knew how it ended. 7 days, he said. He got back in the truck. Riker stood in the drive holding the envelope until the green truck was out of sight. Then he walked to the house and gave it to Elena and told her what was in it, and she read it and put it on the table, face down, and said, "We have 7 days. 7 days to find $31,000. Or 7 days to do something else." She looked at him. "Gerald Foss called this morning while you were up on the ridge." He stared at her. "You didn't... I didn't want to tell you until you'd had your time up there." She reached into her pocket and unfolded a piece of paper where she'd written notes from the call. "He spoke with the county commission chair last night. Harrow's preliminary development inquiry, the 800 acres, it triggered a review requirement because it crosses a floodplain management threshold. The commission is calling Harrow to a meeting next week to explain the scope of the project before any permits are considered." Riker sat down. Foss also said, Elena looked at her notes. He said the commission chair was surprised to learn that the note acquisitions and the development inquiry came from the same entity, surprised and interested in understanding the timeline. Meaning they're looking at whether he was buying the notes as part of the land acquisition strategy. That's what he implied. She folded the paper. He also said he was reaching out to the Missouri Department of Agriculture about the ridge operation specifically. There's a program, new apparently, for alternative agricultural methods on flood-prone land. Documentation of a working model could qualify for a development grant. Riker looked at her. "How much of a grant?" "He didn't say. He said he couldn't promise anything, and we shouldn't count on it." She met his eyes. "But he told me to send him everything we had." They spent that day and the next doing two things simultaneously, building the strongest possible revenue documentation they could, and sending Gerald Foss everything they'd accumulated about the ridge operation. Egg production records, feed cost records, soil observations Elena had been writing in a notebook since September, the gravity water system diagram, photographs Riker had taken on his old camera of the hens foraging, the shelter, the spring. Gus Pereira came by on the second day and sat at the kitchen table with them and said, without being asked, "I'll sign a statement about what I've observed on this ridge and what I've paid for storage and what I think the method is worth. If that helps." "It might help," Elena said. "Then I'll sign it." Gus looked at the documentation spread across the table. "I should have paid more attention to what you were doing up there from the beginning. Should have asked more questions instead of just..." He stopped. I'm not good at admitting I was wrong. Ask my sons. You bought eggs, Riker said. That was enough. It wasn't, Gus said flatly. But it's what I did. He signed the statement. Paul Delory came the following day and signed one too. Dale Hutchins, to Riker's surprise, came without being asked, sat down, and wrote his own statement in his own words. 5 paragraphs in a careful hand about what he'd observed at the Holloway property since August, ending with a sentence that said simply, I was wrong to advise them to give up, and the ridge operation is real, and it works, and this valley would be poorer without it. Riker read it and didn't say anything. He passed it to Elena, who read it and looked at Dale. You didn't have to, she said. No, Dale said, but my wife told me I did, and she's usually right about these things. The call from Gerald Foss came on the 26th, 4 days into the 7-day notice period. I have something to tell you, Foss said when Elena answered, and I want to be clear about what it is and what it isn't, because I don't want you to misunderstand. Go ahead, Elena said. She had the phone against her ear and was looking at Riker across the kitchen table, her face carefully neutral. The Missouri Department of Agriculture has reviewed the documentation on your ridge operation and has approved a provisional development grant under the Resilient Farming Initiative. The amount is $22,000, dispersed on submission of a formal application that I can have in front of you today. He paused. That is not $31,000. No, Elena said. It isn't. The grant is in recognition of a documented working model for flood-resilient agricultural practice. The application process is normally 60 to 90 days, but given the circumstances I've communicated to the department, they've agreed to expedite approval contingent on the documentation you've already submitted. Another pause. I am not in the practice of making promises I can't keep, Mrs. Holloway. The $22,000 is what I can deliver. The $9,000 gap is yours to close. Elena wrote the number on the paper in front of her, looked at it. Thank you, Mr. Foss, she said. I mean that. She hung up and looked at Riker and said, $22,000, and slid the paper across to him. He looked at the number. 9 short. 9 short. He did the math on everything they had, the cash reserves, the revenue from egg sales for the remainder of the week, what they could pull from the small emergency fund without completely emptying it. He came up with $6,800, which left them $2,200 short of what Harrow's acceleration notice demanded. $2,200. After everything, the flood, the hens, the ridge, the sleepless nights, the county office, the grant, $2,200 was still standing between them and the loss of the farm. Elena looked at the number. I need to make some calls. She called Barb at Decker's restaurant first, not to ask for the egg order back, to ask if Decker's would be willing to commit to a 6-month purchasing agreement at a locked price, paid 1 month in advance. She'd been thinking about it for days, the way she thought about things. Quietly, from multiple angles, waiting until the idea was solid before she said it out loud. Barb was quiet for a moment on the phone. You need cash up front. Yes. How much? 6 months of your weekly order, paid today, $240. Another pause. I canceled on you last week, Elena. I know you did. And now you're asking me to prepay. I'm asking if you trust that the eggs are worth it. You've been using them long enough to know the answer. There was a longer pause. Then Barb said, I'll have a check for you by 3 o'clock. Elena called 4 more customers after that, her most reliable, the ones who'd been buying since October. She offered the same arrangement, 6 months of advance purchasing at a locked price. 3 of the 4 said yes inside an hour. The 4th called back that evening and said yes. By the end of the day, she had $960 in advance commitments, which brought them to within $1,240 of the full amount. She sat with that number and was still sitting with it when the knock came at the door at 8 o'clock that evening. It was Tom Gresham. He was 63 years old and had been farming his property since before Riker was born, and he was not a man who came to your door at 8 in the evening without reason. He had an envelope in his hand. My wife and I talked about it, he said, standing in the doorway. We've got some set aside, not a lot, but we know what Harrow's doing to this valley, and we know what you two have been doing on that ridge. And if you lose this farm, that knowledge goes with you, and I don't want that to happen. He held out the envelope. $800. It's what we can do. Riker looked at the envelope. He didn't take it immediately. Tom, we're not... I know you're not asking. I'm offering. Tom's voice had the particular gruffness of a man who was uncomfortable with sentiment and was pushing through it because the sentiment was real. "Take the damn envelope, Riker." Riker took it. Tom left. Elena opened the envelope and counted it and wrote the new number on the paper and looked at it. $440 short. She called Gus Pereira. She didn't explain at length. She told him the amount and she asked directly, which was the only way you could ask Gus anything and expect an answer. He was quiet for 11 seconds. She counted, and then he said, "I'll bring it in the morning." "Gus?" "In the morning," he said, and he hung up. He brought $450 in the morning, 10 more than she'd asked for, and when Elena pointed that out, he said, "Rounding error," in a tone that closed the subject permanently. Elena drove to the bank on the 28th and submitted the revenue documentation. Everything Foss had expedited, the advance purchasing agreements, the neighbor statements, the grant approval letter, along with a check for the full $31,000. She sat across from Mrs. Aldine Fitch in the loan department and put every document on the desk in a precise stack, the way Elena did everything, and said, "We're addressing the acceleration notice in full." Mrs. Fitch looked at the stack. She looked at Elena. "This is a significant amount of documentation." "It is," Elena said, "because the note holder's determination of insufficient operating revenue was incorrect, and I want the bank's records to reflect the actual state of this operation." Mrs. Fitch processed it without comment. What happened inside her during those minutes was unreadable, as it always was. When she was done, she slid the receipt across the counter. "You're current," she said. "I know," Elena said. She sat in the truck in the bank parking lot for a few minutes before driving home. She wasn't crying exactly, but her eyes were doing something in that direction, and she let them do it for a moment because no one was watching and she'd been holding a great deal together for a great many months, and some of it needed somewhere to go. Then she drove home. What happened to Victor Harrow's development plans unfolded over the following weeks, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the grinding, procedural way that institutional processes unfolded. The county commission meeting happened on the 30th of November. Harrow attended with a lawyer and a set of development plans that were considerably more detailed than a preliminary inquiry had suggested. The 800 acres, the processing facility, the infrastructure that would have changed the character of the river valley permanently. The commission asked questions. They asked about the timeline of the note acquisitions relative to the development inquiry. They asked about the use of the acceleration clause across multiple distressed properties. They asked about the floodplain permits and the environmental review and the water rights implications of a facility of that scale drawing from the Missouri watershed. Harrow's lawyer answered most of the questions. Some of them got long answers. Some of them got shorter ones. The commission tabled the development application pending a full environmental review and a formal inquiry into the note acquisition process. It was not a defeat exactly. The application remained active, technically, but it was a delay that had costs, and Harrow's model depended on timing. Land that couldn't be consolidated on schedule, development that couldn't break ground on schedule, financing that had its own deadlines. He didn't come back to the valley after that meeting. His company sent a letter in December formally withdrawing the offer to purchase the Holloway property. It was 2 paragraphs and offered no explanation, which was its own explanation. Riker read it at the kitchen table and put it down and looked at Elena. She was reading it over his shoulder. "Huh," he said. "Huh," she agreed. It wasn't the response the moment might have called for cinematically, but it was the honest one. They were tired. They had been tired for months. The thing they'd been braced against had stepped back, and the relief of that was real, but it was a quiet relief, the kind that comes when you've been holding tension in your body for so long that you've forgotten what the absence of it feels like. It takes a while to notice. The valley didn't come back to normal that winter because there was no normal to come back to. The Machen family had sold and was gone. Their land sat in Harrow's portfolio, though without the other acreage his project required, it was less useful to him than he'd planned. The Garfields were gone too. Those losses were real, and the valley felt them the way a group of people feels the departure of its members. Not in any one moment, but in the accumulated absences, the missing trucks at the grain elevator, the empty pews at the community hall meeting. But other things were happening alongside those losses. Paul Delory didn't sign with Harrow. He spent the winter rebuilding the low barn foundation and planning the northeast timber corner of his property, which he and Ruth walked with Elena twice in January, measuring slope and soil and the small seasonal stream that ran through the stand of oak and hickory. By February, Paul had committed to a spring flock, 50 pullets to start, purchased from the Holloways at cost, just as Elena had offered. Tom and his wife came for dinner in January. They sat at the kitchen table for 4 hours, which was more table time than Tom Gresham had voluntarily logged in any single location in recent memory, and Elena walked him through the ridge operation documentation from the beginning, the soil analysis she'd done with a kit from the extension office, the forage species she'd identified, the water system, the shelter design. Tom asked questions that revealed he'd been thinking about his own high ground, a limestone shelf on the northwest corner of his property, since November. It's different terrain than yours, he said. Most of it will be different terrain, Elena said. The principles are the same. The application varies. What if I put goats up there instead of poultry? Elena thought about it. The forage would support it. The water source needs to be higher capacity for goats. She reached for a piece of paper. Show me the contour. That was January. By March, Tom Gresham had 12 Nubian does on his limestone shelf and was calling Elena twice a week with questions she answered as accurately as she could, and sometimes answered with, I don't know, let's find out, which was a thing she was getting more comfortable saying. Gus expanded the Pereira breeding flock in the spring and kept them on the ridge permanently. His own section of it, the east slope, which he'd essentially annexed through the winter, with Elena's permission and Riker's grudging acceptance of the fact that Gus Pereira's way of acknowledging a debt was to expand into your space and make himself useful. He built a second shelter on the east slope in February, using good lumber from the hardware store rather than flood salvage, and it was considerably better constructed than the original Holloway shelter, which Gus observed out loud with a diplomatic inadequacy that made Elena laugh for the first time in months. The agricultural grant from the department came through in full in February. Gerald Foss called to confirm it personally, and Elena thanked him, and he said, in the careful tone of a bureaucrat who was also a human being, the documentation you submitted was the most thorough I've seen from a first-year operation in 20 years in this office. I want you to know that. My wife kept the ledger, Riker said. He was standing next to Elena, close enough to hear both sides of the call. Then your wife should consider consulting for other operations, Foss said. I'm serious. The ridge documentation has been shared with the department's resilient farming program, and they're using it as a reference model. After they hung up, Elena stood in the kitchen and was quiet for a while. A reference model, she said. That's what he said. She looked out the window at the ridge, bare in February, the hens still visible on the south slope, moving in their methodical way through the dormant grasses. We didn't invent anything, she said. We just followed the birds. That's what makes it interesting, Riker said, that it took us so long to figure out what they already knew. Spring came. The way spring came in the river valley, not gently, not with the pastoral ease that people who didn't farm imagined, but in fits and surges, cold snaps, and sudden warmth and mud that clung to boots and tractor tires and everything that touched the ground. The bottomland dried slowly, the way saturated soil dried. From the surface down, the top layer crusting while the deeper ground stayed cold and wet. Riker planted in April. Not corn. Not yet. Not that field. He planted cover crops in the bottomland, a mix Elena had researched over the winter, chosen to rebuild organic matter and improve drainage and prepare the soil for the corn he planned for the following year. It wasn't a revenue crop. It was an investment in the ground, an acknowledgement that the land needed something before it was asked to produce again. That was a hard decision for a man who needed income, and Riker didn't make it without argument. He and Elena went back and forth for 2 weeks in March. He wanted corn, needed the potential revenue, felt the loss of a planting season like a physical thing. Elena held firm on the cover crop, using numbers and soil science, and the blunt observation that a corn crop planted in exhausted, flood-scoured soil with poor drainage would likely fail, and a failed crop would cost more than a season of cover crop investment. She was right. He knew she was right 3 days into the argument. He kept arguing anyway, because that was the honest shape of how they worked through things. Loud and then quiet and then decided. The eggs were the income through spring and into summer. The flock had grown. Elena had added 20 more pullets in February, bringing the laying flock to just over 100 birds. And the market had come back stronger than before. Barb at Decker's had renewed the purchasing agreement without being asked. The specialty grocery in Millhaven that Elena had approached during the desperate November week had followed through and taken a weekly order. A restaurant in the county seat had heard about the Holloway eggs through a customer who'd bought them at the Caldwell Market and called to inquire. At the Caldwell Market on a Saturday in May, Elena arrived to find that Dale Hutchins's wife, a quiet woman named Marion who sold jams and preserves at the adjacent table, had put a handwritten sign next to her own display that said, "These eggs are from our neighbors, the Holloways. They saved this valley last fall. It's worth knowing." Elena stood and read the sign for a moment. Then she went over and hugged Marion Hutchins, which was not something Elena did easily or often, and Marion patted her back and said, "Oh, honey, it needed to be said," which made Elena laugh and press her face against Marion's shoulder for a moment to hide what was happening in her eyes. She told Riker about it that evening. He was quiet for a moment. "Marion Hutchins made you a sign," he said. "She did." "Huh." "Yeah." He thought about it. "We should have her and Dale for dinner." "I already invited them," Elena said, "Saturday." He didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table in May, how to fully account for the distance between August and now. The arithmetic of it was clear enough. The flood, the debt, the birds, the ridge, Harrow, the grant, the neighbors, the $2,200 that had arrived in increments from the people around them. He could lay those facts end to end, and they made a story that was comprehensible. What was harder to account for was the way the year had changed him, not improved him. That was too clean a word for it. Changed him in the way that difficulty changes people when they survive it without becoming bitter, which was not guaranteed and was not comfortable, and was not the work of a single good decision but of 1,000 small ones made when tired and scared and uncertain. He'd been wrong about things this year. He'd wanted to give up in October, and had only been kept from it by Elena's refusal to give up with him. He'd been wrong about the cover crops until he wasn't. He'd driven to the Machins and the Dolores with Elena's ridge documentation and had privately believed on the drive home that Paul Delory had read him correctly, that they were partly motivated by the need for allies, and that there was something not entirely clean about that motivation. There was something not entirely clean about it. That was just true. What was also true was that Paul's cows were alive and Ruth's seed stores were dry, and Tom Gresham's breeding does were grazing a limestone shelf that had never been grazed in living memory, and the Delores hadn't signed with Harrow, and the Greshams hadn't signed with Harrow, and Victor Harrow's plan to consolidate 2/3 of the valley's farmable land into a single corporate operation had failed not because of a legal challenge or a regulatory intervention, though those had helped, but because a sufficient number of families had found, in the same 2 weeks, a reason not to sell. The reason was a hill and 86 hens that kept climbing it until someone followed them. There was a lesson in that, though Riker was cautious about lessons, cautious about the tidy packaging of difficult experience into something that could be stated cleanly and passed along. Life didn't work in stated lessons. It worked in the accumulation of specific details. The weight of a ledger in Elena's hands, the sound of chicks from the mudroom in the dark, the look on Paul Delory's face when he showed up at midnight in the rain and started moving things without being asked. But if he was pressed, if someone sat him down and said, "What did you learn from this year, Riker Holloway? What is the thing you'd carry forward?" he thought it would be something like this. The answers are usually already there. They're in the ground under your feet, in the instincts of creatures that haven't been taught to ignore inconvenient knowledge, in the observation of what is actually happening rather than what you expected to happen. The hens didn't know they were solving a problem. They just knew where the good ground was, and they went to it again and again until the people watching them finally got tired of bringing them back and walked up the hill to see for themselves. That was the thing about wisdom that nobody told you when you were young. It rarely came in the form of a revelation. It came in the form of something you'd walked past 20 times and finally stopped to look at. It came from following the small, persistent things that kept pointing in the same direction until you had no excuse not to see what they were pointing at. Elena had known before he did, in August, that the 86 chicks were not a burden. She'd known it before she could have explained why she knew it. That was not mystical. It was not luck. It was the particular attentiveness of someone who'd been trained by her own life to watch things carefully and not dismiss what she saw because it was inconvenient. He was trying to learn that from her. He was 35 years old and still trying to learn it. That was probably how it worked. You didn't arrive at it. You just kept working at it. In August, a year after the first flood, Riker walked the south fence line in the early morning the way he'd walked it every August morning since that first one, the old habit of watching the river. The Missouri was at normal level, running steady and quiet in the summer heat. The bottomland corn was 8 feet tall. Not the same field, not quite the same soil after the cover crop winter, but close and green and promising in the way that growing corn was always promising before it was anything else. He walked up to the ridge after. He did that every morning too now. The fence line check, then the ridge walk, the 2 anchors of his day. The hens were already out. 104 of them now, plus Gus's 40 on the east slope, plus the 12 birds Paul Delory had added after the spring flock grew faster than expected. The ridge was busier than it had been the first winter. More animals, more paths worn into the grass. The spring seep now channeled through a proper pipe system that Gus's sons had helped install in June. More built, more managed, more human. But the hens still moved through it the way they always had, with the unhurried focus of creatures doing exactly what they were designed to do, in a place that let them do it. They didn't know what the year had been. They didn't know about the ledger or the letters or the man in the green truck. They knew the hill. They knew the forage was good here and the water was clean and the south slope was warm in the morning and there was always something worth finding if you were patient enough to scratch for it. Elena came up the trail behind him. She did that sometimes. Waited until he'd been up there alone for a while. Then came. She understood the different kinds of time he needed, which was one of the 1,000 things about her that he'd never adequately thanked her for, and probably never would in any one moment, because it would have to be thanked for over the course of an entire life, in the ordinary daily evidence of a man trying to be worth what someone had chosen to believe in him. She stood beside him and looked at the valley below, the corn, the river, the neighboring properties, the Delory place with its northeast timber corner, the Gresham farm with its northwest shelf, the empty Machin land, still sitting, unplanted, a gap in the valley's working order that hadn't been filled yet. Maybe it would be. Maybe someone would find their way to it. The Caldwell market called, Elena said. They want us to do a demonstration, the Ridge method. They're organizing a regional farming forum in October and they want us to present. Speak at a forum, Riker said. Present the documentation. Walk people through the method. She paused. Foss will be there. Apparently the department wants to expand the resilient farming program and they're looking for models to feature. Riker thought about standing in front of a room of farmers and explaining what they'd done. He thought about how he would have described it before this year and how he'd describe it now. Before. We got lucky. The birds found the good ground. We followed them. Now, the same thing, but meaning it differently. Not as self-deprecation, but as the plain statement of a fact he'd come to take seriously. The birds found the good ground. That was the beginning of everything. Okay, he said. Okay, I'll talk about the birds. You talk about the numbers. Elena allowed herself a smile. Not the 3-second kind. The real one, the one that took its time. That's probably the right division of labor, she said. They stood on the ridge in the August morning, the valley spread below them, the Missouri running its old course in the distance, indifferent and ancient and continuous. The hens moved through the grass behind them, doing their patient, methodical work. The farm was theirs. The debt was gone. The ridge was proven. None of that had been certain at any point in the 12 months preceding this morning, and the knowledge of that uncertainty didn't leave you just because the outcome had turned. It stayed in your body, the memory of what it had felt like to stand at the edge of losing everything. Riker suspected it would stay there for a long time. He suspected that was not entirely a bad thing, that the memory of what things could cost made you less careless with what you had. He didn't say any of that to Elena. She knew it. She'd been standing at the same edge. A hen crossed the path in front of them, moving with purpose towards something in the grass that had caught its attention. It didn't look up. It didn't acknowledge the 2 humans watching it. It went where it was going, the way it always went where it was going, because that was what it did, and the hill was there and the forage was good, and there was no reason not to. The ridge held, the same as it always had. The valley, slowly, was learning to listen.